Welcome to the Legally Ever After Real Estate Podcast, where we help you build, protect, and pass on your assets. I'm your host, estate planning attorney, Pamela Moss-Garrett. Let's get started. All right. On today's episode, we have Carin Ramirez. She is an attorney focused on construction defect litigation, and she's going to be talking to us about some construction defect tips for real estate. Welcome, Carin.
Hi, Pam. Thank you.
All right. So kind of starting off, you are a very experienced professional in this area. And I know from just talking to you and knowing you over the years, you've seen a lot in the construction field. What are kind of some general tips that you have for people who are investing, who are aware of litigation and want to better invest and better protect themselves?
Yeah, I would say, if you're looking at buying a property, I think, I sort of distinguish between properties that are less than 10 years old and more than 10 years old. 10 years is a somewhat random amount of time, but the reason I pick that is that newer construction, so less than 10 years old, if there are going to be problems arising from things that were not done properly in construction, they typically are going to have arisen in the first 10 years. So if you're looking at something less than 10 years old, I think you need to be extra careful, before you make the purchase. And I would recommend having either an engineer or architect that does forensic work walk the property with you, or if you have a friend that's an architect or an engineer that looks at buildings on a regular basis, have them walk the property with you, because there are certain sort of red flags that someone like that would see right away. I'm not an architect or engineer, but I would see certain things right away. There's just a lot of red flags that a professional like that could spot that your inspector that does typical home inspections or building inspections is not going to pick up on, because they do more of a superficial look at things. But, someone that does this sort of work really knows what to hone in on. And then buildings that are older than 10 years, would be a little different because things have already happened. So then you're looking for evidence of repairs that have been done.
So that's really helpful, Carin, just to kind of recap what you're saying. If you're looking to invest in a property that's less than 10 years versus more than 10 years, there's going to be different things you're looking for, and there's going to be different steps you're going to take. And if it's less than 10 years, it sounds like there's a lot of red flags because, as you mentioned, things may not have come to the surface yet. Whereas after 10 years, you're going to be looking for signs for repairs. A lot of the issues would have come to the surface. So what are some of the red flags for newer construction that's less than 10 years that, you want to pick up on?
Sure. When I look at a property, I start on the outside, look at the drainage. I mean, generally you want things to slope away from the building so that water's not ponding right next to the building. So that's something that anybody could see. That's pretty easy. The main thing is that moisture can damage buildings. So I always look at the top of the roof. Does the roof hang out over the building? That's good, because then your water's going to fall away. If it has a right angle at the top of the roof, then that needs to have been constructed just right so that water's not getting into the wall. So that's something I would look closely at, that sort of a situation. When I'm inside a building, I look at the ceilings. Is there any sort of staining or evidence of painting on the ceilings, like patchwork? And then you want to look for cracks in the walls. They typically start to form around windows and doors. In Colorado, at least along the Front Range, we have expansive soils, which, if not handled properly, can cause a building to move. So you want to look for signs that the building's moving. And that usually shows up as cracks, often around the corners, the top corners of windows and doors. Some amount of cracking is normal, like there's drywall cracks. But if you start to see cracks that go all the way across a wall, more than a couple inches long, you'd want someone to look into why is that happening.
Another interesting thing that you mentioned was kind of not relying solely on an inspector. And I think that a lot of us who aren't in the field day to day might just think, oh, I'm just going to have an inspector and I'm going to use the inspector that someone recommended. And it sounds like that might not be the right route to go. What's your experience or thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I'm buying something as an investment, particularly, you want to make sure you know what you're buying. And I just think that home inspectors, while they serve a certain purpose, I mean, they're looking for major problems, but they are not sort of investigate it. They really don't look beneath the surface. And I don't think they look for certain red flags, but not to the same extent that, someone that really does sort of forensic building work would be looking at. And the goal is to protect your investment. You don't want to buy something and then find out that it's going to need major repairs, that someone could have told you on the front end. And I just think, home inspectors have an important purpose, but they don't do that deep investigation. An architect or engineer might pull building department records, see who the architect and engineers were for the building. I would, if I were getting new build as an investment, probably look at who built it, what is their track record, what does their insurance look like? If it's new build and something goes really wrong, especially if it's a more, higher end investment, if there are repairs that need to be made, is the builder or the architect or the developer going to stand behind that? And is there going to be insurance money? If repairs are needed, is there going to be someone there that can actually pay that if you were going to have to bring a claim?
Yeah. So kind of the second tip is looking at who built it and do they have the insurance that they need? And how would you really determine that? I mean, would you inquire from it, look at the insurance? Like, what's the best way to really evaluate that yourself?
Yeah, I think you would have to ask for the information. It's not typically publicly available. Most building departments don't. Some building departments will require insurance, so you might be able to find it there, but you'd probably have to ask whoever you're buying it from if they know. If you're buying it straight from the builder or developer, you can just ask them. If you're a subsequent purchaser down the road, you might have to go to whoever it was and that built the building and ask for that information directly.
Where have you seen this gone wrong? Or do you have an example of like someone not having the insurance that they need or not kind of covering the repairs?
Sure. I've had one case jumps to mind. It was a situation, it was a multifamily, townhouses or condominiums. And the developer was really relying on the general contractor and architects to have the insurance money for the project. So the developer didn't have very good insurance of their own, assuming that if there was any issue, the general contractor and architect would. Well, several years later, when there started to be problems at the building, unfortunately, the architect and the general contractor had both died. And the developer did not really know what their insurance had been. He just sort of assumed they'd be around. So now the homeowners that had bought these properties, there wasn't really any insurance money to go after because the people weren't around. The developer didn't have good records. They ultimately recovered from the developer, but it was questionable. If the developers hadn't happened to have significant assets to pay the claim, it would have been a problem for the investors that bought the properties.
That's super helpful. And that's scary, right? It's scary to think about because, a lot of times we just assume that the people we're in business with have good insurance, and you get to see the other end of that, which is not the case. Any other kind of tips when it comes to investing in real estate from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think something that's important is that if you're going to do work, if you're going to buy a property and fix it up and then sell the property, or even if you do standard repairs while you own a property and then you're going to sell it, I think it's important to know that you are then subject to a claim for the work that you performed. If something, though you hired a contractor, if something you hired that contractor to do doesn't end up being done correctly and later there's a problem after you sell, the buyer could come after you because you were the person in charge at the time those improvements were done. And that would go out 8 years, really, from when you do the improvement, or 8 years from when you sell the property. So you want to make sure you have your own insurance if you do any sort of work on like that. Now, you again are going to want to assume that your contractor is insured. And, if that's what you're going to rely on, just make sure you've checked all those documents and that their insurance is legit when you have them do the work. But I would think you would want to have some of your own insurance as well, just in case.
That's super helpful, and kind of be knowledgeable about the role you're playing and the potential for liability. And then that extended period of time, 8 years, is a very long time period to be potentially liable. How about any other tips that you have?
If you're going to buy any residential property, and this is more rental, but if you're going to have people living in if you're going to have rental properties, I think a really simple thing people should do to protect themselves is make sure you have proper carbon monoxide detectors. I'm not a plaintiff's attorney at all, but it's a very simple thing that can go wrong, that can be devastating, and it's very simple, and document what you're doing. So before you lease out a property, put in new batteries in the carbon monoxide detector, take a picture of that, write it down in a log somewhere. So if anything goes wrong, you're protected, because people take batteries out too. But at least if you can prove that it was proper when you turned over a property to someone, that's a big one.
That's super helpful. Is there other areas that tend to be more litigious here in Colorado? So one is, we've been talking about carbon monoxide. We've been talking about kind of repairs. We've talked about drainage issues and expansive soils. Is there anything else that is something that people should be aware of?
If you own a property, you are liable as a property owner under premises liability, which means if anyone gets hurt on your property, even if you're not there, you've leased it out, you only check on it once a month. As the record owner of a property, you're responsible if anyone gets hurt on the property. So that's, I think, something people should know, and make sure, talk to your insurance broker, make sure you have, appropriate coverage for that sort of situation. And that applies to whether it's a commercial property or a residential property, anywhere people might be going.
That's a great tip. Any other tips, Carin?
Those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Those are like the sort of the big things that come up.
What are some common mistakes that you see?
In terms of construction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, personally, I think I tell people I wouldn't probably buy a stucco building. Stucco's really popular in the Front Range. It can be a really great product if it's done correctly. But I think the reality of the labor situation in Colorado and everywhere right now is that there's a labor shortage. So people that are constructing buildings or roads or landscape management, whatever, often are day laborers that don't have a lot of experience. So the reality is a lot of times people building buildings right now don't necessarily, it might not be something they've done before. And so things like stucco that really need to be done appropriately, I mean, I would look extra hard if I was going to buy a building with stucco. I probably wouldn't do it, even though it's a great project, because a lot of times when things go wrong, that's where I see it going wrong. But the reality is, and it's not that people are doing, developers and general contractors aren't doing their best. It's just that the reality of the situation is a lot of times the on the ground people installing construction work in Colorado don't have a lot of experience. And so things can just go wrong. So that's just one thing that goes wrong a lot is stucco. The other, soils in Colorado are a big deal. And so if I were going to buy a property, I would ask for the soils report. Actually, they're required to give it to you by law. So you probably get it from your real estate broker, but maybe you don't know how important it is and you don't look that closely at it. The thing you want to look at is the part about expansive soils. How expansive are the soils at your building? Just because there's expansive soils doesn't mean you shouldn't buy the building, but you do want to see what were their recommendations of the foundation and how the building was built, and was that followed by the builder? So that's something that can be a big problem, because if the foundation of a building moves and things start cracking, sometimes you have to tear the building down. Sometimes you can fix it. Sometimes you can't. It can be a very devastating problem for a building.
So I know, we've been talking about the investor in a few different contexts, and kind of shifting, because I know you represent a lot of developers and subcontractors. Is there some kind of common mistakes or things that you tell them after they come to you and everything's gone wrong, of like, hey, these are the things you should proactively change to really protect yourself in the future?
From a business point of view, I would say it's insurance. Find an insurance broker that really knows about, if you're in the construction industry, make sure your broker really understands construction defect litigation, what kind of coverage you have. If you have an attorney, I would talk to them about your insurance situation and have them take a look at it, because I run into a lot of people that thought they were insured well and really aren't. Whether it's developers, general contractors, subcontractors, one thing to keep into account is that you might build a building for $2 million now, and so you think $2 million is enough coverage. But as we've seen, construction costs can go way up really fast, and to tear a building down and rebuild it is more expensive. And a lot of time, the repairs that are needed, if they're extensive, cost more than the original build does. So I would have a real, serious conversation. No one wants to pay extra for more insurance, but you also don't want to get into a situation where you're underinsured, because then, someone can come after you personally for your assets in some situations. So that's, I think, the number one thing is folks often don't have an understanding of the insurance. Some brokers are really great, others aren't as good, or it's just not their specialty. And I think, especially if you're going to be hiring people, if you're a developer and you're going to hire a general contractor, or if you're a general contractor and you're going to hire subcontractors, understand what everyone's insurance requirements are, who's covering what. If you're a subcontractor and whoever you're working for requires you to have additional insured coverage, make sure you have the right coverage. Make sure your broker has looked at that, because if you don't and there's a claim later, you can be found personally to be the insurance company for yourself, which is a bad situation to be in. You could have to pay, what your insurance company should be paying if you had, checked the right box on your form. So those are things that I think folks generally, when I see people getting in trouble, it's because they didn't have the insurance that they thought they had.
And so do you have any tips as people in this field are kind of interviewing insurance brokers of things they should be asking to make sure they're getting someone that's qualified enough or focused enough in the area?
Yeah, I think, if they work with a lot of contractors and have a lot of construction clients, they probably have a better understanding. If talk to them about additional insured, have them talk you through what that means. If they can't explain it to you in a way that makes sense, they probably don't understand it very well. I would ask questions, how did they make sure, are they going to look at your contract? When you enter a contract, can you send it to them? Will they look at it for you and make sure you have what it says you're supposed to have? If a person's not willing to do that, that's not going to be the right person for you.
And then the same question for working with a good attorney. Like, I know you work directly with developers and contractors to support them. When those people are looking for an attorney to really help them be proactive, sometimes it's, things have gone wrong, but sometimes it's, hey, how can we be proactive? What are some good questions for an attorney to make sure you're getting someone that has the level of experience and expertise?
Yeah, I would ask, I think a lot of folks that look at contracts and help people write contracts, that's what we call transactional attorneys. I would ask them if they have any experience with litigation. I think someone that has done some of both is a good person, because litigation folks understand what can go wrong with a contract or insurance. Transactional people aren't as in the trenches with that. So someone that does a little of both, I think, is ideal, or at least has folks they can call up and talk to. I often get contracts with major developers, that don't realize important things about Colorado law that, voids what they think is a key part of their contract isn't even valid under Colorado law. And they're shocked when they hear that from me as they're getting sued. So I think you want to talk with whoever's doing your contracts. How are they keeping up to date on developments in the law? Do they track, big judgments and lawsuits and understand, why those, at least in the construction field, why are folks getting hit with big judgments or big awards, what went wrong, so that they have an understanding. They should at least be, up to date on that sort of thing.
Do you see any kind of trends right now in the construction world here in Colorado that people should be aware of or that you're seeing on your end?
I think it's been an ongoing trend in Colorado that it's very homeowner friendly, there's just pros and cons to that. If you're a developer or a general contractor, unfortunately, the law in many cases is not going to be favorable to you if there's a lawsuit. It's just very protective of homeowners. A recent thing that's happened that people aren't really aware of is that there's certain protections given to residential property owners. The courts in Colorado have decided that would include things like senior living facilities, apartment buildings, things that we would think of as commercial. basically if someone lives there, even if it's a huge, 400 unit apartment building owned by a national company that runs apartments all over the world, they're going to get the same protections that, your grandma and grandpa are going to get if something goes wrong at the property. And so sometimes when you think you're commercial in Colorado, you're really residential. And really what it comes down to is if people live there or could live there or not. But the trend in Colorado, it's very homeowner protective, which is great if you're a homeowner. If you're a developer or a contractor, it just means, the laws are somewhat stacked against you. And it's very hard to do everything right, even if you try. We see construction and development companies often have QC companies that come in and they think they're getting good protection that way. And they're really not. Those QC companies will almost never accept any liability. Like if something's drastically wrong and they miss it, they're not liable for missing it. Their contracts will say that. So, if I would hire someone that's willing to accept some liability if they miss something major like that, rather than someone that's going to say, yeah, it's not my problem.
So there's kind of quality control companies that can be brought in, and some of them will assume liability, some of them won't. And then are you seeing any trends of developers bringing in attorneys like you to help train their team or their people on site to kind of protect a little bit better and prevent some issues?
We do some of that. Some construction companies will have us, we can do a talk, once a year, every couple of years. Like these are the top 10 sort of defects that we're seeing right now. So that can help you, stucco, there's certain things that we see over and over in every case as an allegation. So we can tell your folks, these are things to look for. I would say the caveat to that is that it's always evolving. So as we are kind of helping folks not make those mistakes, the experts that kind of do this sort of work are always finding new things. Building science is always developing and changing. So the way things are built changes and then new problems arise. But I definitely think, if you want to be proactive, you can reach out to me. Anyone that does construction defect litigation would probably come and talk to you about, we'll do kind of like a top 10 seminar. These are the things, big ticket items that we see go wrong a lot that, you should have your QC folks in-house should be looking at these things.
This is super helpful, Carin. Kind of segueing from that, can you tell everyone a little bit about the type of clients you work with and what the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. I represent anyone really that does construction or is in the construction industry, real estate developers, general contractors, subcontractors, engineers, architects, and you can reach me. I work at Higgins, Hopkins, McLean, and Roswell is my law firm. I think the easiest way to reach me is by phone or by email, and you can also go to our firm website and find me there, but you can call me at 303-987-7140 or reach me at Ramirez at hhmrlaw.com. I'm happy to, talk with folks if you just have general questions. If there's something you need specific help with, we can talk about that as well. Or if you wanted us to come and talk to your company, we're happy to do that as well.
And so you do the litigation side when things go wrong, but you can also kind of, it sounds like, help your clients prevent things from going wrong as well.
Yeah, we often will do contract review for our clients, take a look at, if you had insurance questions you wanted us to look at, we'll do contract review for clients that we work with, just to help you prevent having some of these problems down the road.
That's great. So the final question that I ask everybody is, what is your legacy?
Well, what I try to put out in the world is, to try to help people through difficult times. It's often not your fault. You didn't mean to do something wrong and you thought you had your bases covered and you didn't. So helping people through difficult times. I try to, make the world a better place than I left it to the extent I can for my family and friends. Just try to, I think, mistakes happen and it doesn't mean you're a bad person. And, I think we should all help each other, get through problems. And that's what I try to do for folks that I work with or live with or are friends with.
Well, thank you so much, Carin. This has been super helpful, and I'll include a link to all of your contact information in our show notes.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. If you need an updated will, trust, or estate plan, and you are a Colorado resident, we would love to be your estate planning law firm. give us a call at 720-706-0036 to schedule your complimentary 15-minute call. You can also directly schedule at lawmother.com/go. If you liked this episode and you want to learn more, you should definitely check out my international best-selling book, Legally Ever After. It's available on Amazon as both an ebook, a paperback, and an audio version. And if you'd like a free chapter, head over to lawmother.com/LEA.